There were all kinds of institutions that workers could turn to in the factories if they were unhappy about conditions. They could turn to the labor unions, and most writers think that the labor unions were completely eviscerated in the early 30s. No, I don't think so, because we have lots of records, or I found lots of records of trade unions responding to workers' complaints positively. There were commissions within the factories on which workers sat, and they had the ability to criticize and demand redress of grievances, and there are any number of cases in which that happened. So, and you can think of the Communist Party itself as, in one way, as a giant complaint bureau across the country. And so workers learned very quickly, it wasn't hard to learn the right kind of language to use. They would say, you are not defending the working class. You talk about all these benefits and wonderful things for the working class, and look at the conditions in the cafeteria. They're filthy and so on. And nobody could say Stalin is a jerk, socialism sucks, that type of thing. You couldn't say that. But as far as criticizing local conditions, and even up to the level of the factory director, and not the top party boss in the region, but maybe the second level, there are many, many cases of that. And workers participated in these commissions and in the trade unions and so on. And so I see all of that as part of the state apparatus and as the intersection of state and society. You can't separate state from society because there were so many, many ways in which people participated in state organizations that had some power to get things changed.
Hello everyone, it's your host Tony. Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism. What you just heard is a snippet of this episode's discussion featuring Robert Thurston. If you're a new listener, this show is a podcast dedicated to exploring past, present, and future manifestations of real-world socialism from a socialist perspective by speaking to those who've studied extensively, lived in, or currently live in a socialist nation. Robert joins the show to talk about his extensive archival research on the Soviet Union, specifically the Soviet Union in the 1930s. We're going to be looking in depth at the infamous so-called Great Terror or mass arrests of 1937 to 1938, and in doing so, Robert rebuts the perennial anti-communist argument, the claim that the Soviet Union was totalitarian. We also discuss the impact his research had on his career, the role the CIA and other intelligence services played in the manufacturing of Soviet history for Western audiences, and much more. Robert W. Thurston is a professor emeritus of history at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. He has a PhD in modern Russian history. He's also the author of Life and Terror in Stalin's Russia, 1939 to 1941, which is the focus of our episode today. Of course, I recommend checking this excellent piece of scholarship out. He's also written on a wide variety of other important historical subjects, including coffee, a comprehensive guide to the bean, the beverage, and industry, and most recently, he's written The Body in the Anglosphere, 1880 to 1920, Well-Sexed Womanhood, Finer Natives, and Very White Men. You can check out his blogs, which feature some of his research and commentary on modern geopolitical events at thirstrw, so that's thurst.rw at wordpress.com. His blog is linked in the show notes. He's also the managing director of Oxford Coffee Company. Again, more info about that in the show notes. If you haven't caught on already, Robert is a true Renaissance man. Further info regarding our discussion can be found at patreon.com/AESthepodcast. If you do wish to contribute as a subscriber, you'll gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. Shout out to my patrons. If you're unable to contribute, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Feel free to leave a review if you have the time. I recommend checking out the backlog as well if you have the chance. But most importantly, you can help out by engaging in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be. The opening interlude for this episode is a clip from 2005. It features Robert Thurston's academic rival and CIA MI5 plant, Robert Conquest, a major proponent of the totalitarian thesis. In this clip, he receives the Presidential Medal of Freedom from everyone's favorite president, George W. Bush.
Conflicts of this young century demand a clear-eyed understanding of the great dramas and tragedies of the 20th century. And perhaps no scholar has studied that time with as much diligence or intellectual courage as Robert Conquest. His life began in 1917, the year of the Russian Revolution, whose evil consequences he would so thoroughly and faithfully detail in The Great Terror and other memorable writings. The truths he told were not always in fashion, but the cautionary lessons he taught about murderous ideologies and the men who served them will always be relevant. His books have been translated into 20 languages, and there have been times and places when those books were carefully hidden. Today, the empire he revealed is gone forever, and the works of Robert Conquest are an enduring testament of the truth. This wise and eloquent man is greatly admired by his fellow Americans and by all who love freedom.
Hi, Robert. It's so great to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Tony. Thanks a lot for having me on.
So let's get right into it, Robert. I've already done a couple episodes on the Soviet Union, particularly the 1930s. I had Samantha Lom on to discuss the 1936 Constitution, which she's an expert in. I've had Michael Carley join the show to discuss the Soviets' attempt to create a collective security agreement between Britain and France in the lead up to World War II. And in both those discussions, what was briefly mentioned, of course, talking about the 1930s, is what's known as the Great Purges or the Great Terror, which takes place, between 1937 to 1938, roughly. I know that you're an expert in that, so I'm very happy to have you on the show. But before we get into that, I always like finding out why my guests study the things that they do. What drew you to study the Stalin period of the Soviet Union as an American, particularly during the Cold War?
First of all, as a kid, I was not a total nerd, but I liked to read history. So I read all kinds of history just for fun, if you can imagine that. Anyway, I went to graduate school finally at the University of Michigan. And at that time, I started in, 1972. And so there was no hope at that point of studying anything about the Soviet Union in the 1930s, but I'd always been fascinated by that period, especially by the Soviet victory in World War II. If things were so very horrible in the 1930s, how was it that the Red Army won? And Churchill said that the Red Army tore the guts out of the German army. Really, you could argue that the Germans were defeated in their basic war aims as early as October 1941. To back up a little bit from that, I first took a course in Russian history at Northwestern University as an undergraduate in 1968. And that was one hell of a year, of course. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy, police riot, as it was called, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I never had the intention of studying Russian history, but the professor that I had, David Jarafsky, was great, and I think gave a kind of account of Soviet history that I had just not been introduced to before, and that is the idea that the revolution might have been popular, and again, that the victory in World War II might have been because of support for the regime. Basically, lying behind all that was, of course, the Vietnam War. So why were we in Vietnam? Okay, we were there to stop communism. So what was communism? In an effort, as clumsy as it was, and I was 19 years old, I wanted to try to find out what the heck this thing called communism was. And that led back to the Russian Revolution, all of Russian history. So I started to study the Russian language at that point. So I kind of fell into it, you might say, without any conscious plan whatsoever.
Well, I will say that I'm quite glad that you fell into it because your work on it is incredibly informative and educational and very useful.
Thank you.
So it was a worthwhile series of events to occur. So you were part of what was at the time a new school of Western Sovietology, that is to say the study of the Soviet Union, that pushed back and ultimately caused the retreat of what was at the time the dominant view of the Soviet Union, known as the totalitarian view. Could you explain what the totalitarian model or view is and what yours and other scholars' thesis was in response?
By the way, at the time, I'm sure you've seen this, the two schools of thought were the Orthodox school, which did invoke the various theories of totalitarianism. And then I was part of what was called the revisionist school, which challenged all of that stuff and also challenged the idea that Stalin had ruled by terror all the way from, let's say, 1925 to his death in 1953. As far as I understand the totalitarian model, or models plural, and there are numerous ones, the essence of it all is that the state is distinct from society, and the state rules over people by controlling the whole of the economy, the instruments of violence, and education, propaganda, and also, of course, rules by force. Maybe not exclusively, but overwhelmingly by force. And there are permutations and variations of that kind of idea, but certainly the idea that the Soviet Union was ruled by terror was and is a common argument. You may have even seen that the United States House of Representatives, I'm sure you saw that, just passed a resolution denouncing socialism, saying it always leads to terror, totalitarianism, etc. So it's still very much out there.
So I did pull this definition of totalitarianism from Google, so take it for what you will. It's pretty similar to what you said. And so they defined it as a system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state.
In academic discussions, I mean, that's fine as far as it goes, but in academic discussions, I think the word terror, rule by terror, comes up over and over and over again from anybody who's using the idea of totalitarianism. And that, by the way, was one of the key factors that got us into Vietnam. That all so-called communist states, they didn't call themselves that. They called themselves socialist states. But the idea that they were all ruled by terror and that we, the noble Americans, had to stop the dominoes from falling, another dumb theory, and that we had to stop communism in Vietnam because it meant terror, total absence of freedom, that kind of thing.
In terms of the concept of totalitarianism, when I was thinking about it, because it's often used, of course, to really put both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union together as being actually the same form of government with, maybe different rhetoric behind it. In thinking about that, it made me wonder if the thesis itself, and you can share your thoughts on this if you want to, if the thesis itself is essentially a tool to demonize essentially enemies of the West, or so like say, for example, using the definition that we just talked about, one could apply that to the European colonies in Africa or in Asia, the deep south in the US, using terror to rule. So then with that idea, would those be considered totalitarian as well if that was applied universally rather than just to enemies of the West?
Yes, I think so. There's always, of course, the question of what terror means. And then there's the question of did any of those regimes that you've mentioned, colonial, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union under Stalin, did they intend to rule by terror? And this is, by the way, a big aspect of recent books on slavery in the American South. How much was the stick employed, that is punishment, fear, coercion, and how much was there a carrot of any kind to any degree, some reward? But let me go back, if you don't mind, to the history of the word totalitarianism. You probably know it was coined by the Italian fascists in the 1920s, and it was a proud boast of Mussolini's government. We are the totalitarian government. Almost nobody takes that seriously. That's ironic. Mussolini didn't rule by terror for the most part, although his government regime was quite violent toward dissenters. But totalitarianism really came into its own as a term after World War II. And you were right, it was to try to make the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany sound the same. And it was a way of trying to explain after World War II why we had fought against the German people on the side of the Soviet people, and now Germany was our friend, the Soviet Union was our enemy. So how did anybody explain that? Well, the term totalitarianism worked in some people's minds quite well to explain that. And the idea was that Hitler's government had been totalitarian, and it had kept the noble suffering German people in bondage, and if Hitler said jump, they had to say how high on the way up, that kind of thing. And the same thing in the Soviet Union. So the idea has always been the government or the state, the regime, whatever term you like, has been evil. And you still see that among American conservatives and even other historians. The state is something evil. The people are basically good, but they are crushed by this evil thing called the state. So looking at Hitler's Germany, once the Third Reich was gone, the people could be declared noble again and could be declared our friends. Meanwhile, we could still use that idea to say the Soviet Union is basically evil because its totalitarian government survived and it rules over these terribly oppressed Russian people, Russian and, of course, many other nationalities in the Soviet Union. So we still have this idea in many works, a clear division between state and society. And I don't think that, as I tried to indicate in my book, Life and Terror, I don't think that works very well. The state, where does the state somehow end and society somehow begin? Sometimes you get the idea of civil society existing outside of the bounds of the state. Okay, that may happen. I think we have a civil society in the United States, but it doesn't mean that the state is without its influence. I'm not a believer in the deep state. I don't have to say that. I don't understand that concept. But in the Soviet Union, again, the state involved people at so many different levels, certainly down into the collective farms and the factory floor. So I think that's why, again, totalitarianism became such a useful idea. It could explain why people were good, but their government or regime was bad.
As you've just kind of, given a explanation of the utility of the totalitarian model, what was it like pushing against this model in both a personal and academic sense?
I'm probably not the one to say whether my own work was good or bad. It's possible that I wrote bad history. The fact is that after I published that book, and I should mention that I made it onto the cover of the New York Times Sunday book review section and got slammed, absolutely slammed. It's one of the worst reviews I've ever seen in the New York Times book review section. I was not invited to conferences after the book came out, conferences on that topic. I was invited to conferences before my book came out. So either I wrote really bad history or I was marginalized in some sense in the field. There were all kinds of personal attacks. One of my favorite attacks was in a Russian language newspaper in this country, called, the translation would be The New Russian Word. And they started by saying, here's a person who lives in Oxford, but not that Oxford. He teaches at Miami University, but not that Miami. It sort of went on like that. And I wanted to say, wait, I'm a real person. So there were these various ad hominem attacks and attacks that I thought were really, that they fell back upon conventional wisdom. And I was called naive, and I responded. That was at a conference in Germany. I responded and said, well, wait a minute, how can I be called naive if I am the one who's gone through all these materials, all these archival materials, things like factory newspapers? I read more memoirs at that period than you can shake a stick at. So I said, wait a minute, you're falling back on the idea that without any serious investigation, and I must say people like Robert Conquest, they didn't do the serious investigation of how the mass arrests worked. And so I thought, gee, I'm not getting the attention that I deserved, or the attention that would have been commensurate with my vanity, as the phrase goes. Okay. So I don't know why exactly. I mean, the book gets cited a lot, and I don't think I've moved away from that field in further work. So I follow it, but I don't follow it religiously. But I still have yet to see a book that dives into the dynamics of what actually happened. For example, there's a big multi-volume biography of Stalin by Stephen Kotkin. And when he goes to try to explain the terror, he falls back on phrases like, all dictators want more power. wait a minute, that doesn't explain anything. So I think people, they thought, and I was charged with whitewashing Stalin. I was charged with not understanding anything about what really happened. So my ego survived, Tony, but I took a lot of hits at that point. And again, the book is cited. There's no question about that. So it's still to this day. So it lives in a certain sense. I'm still waiting to see somebody come along and really replace what I did. Maybe that's just a point of pride on my part. But I think, again, if you look at something like Conquest or the biography by Stephen Cochrane, the detail is massive, but the explanations are, and the investigation of effects on the Soviet people. To what degree did they really feel fear? Those investigations are not taken very far in recent work, I don't think.
That's one thing I really like about reading your work is, as you mentioned, a lot of archival research was behind it. Also, I really enjoyed the addition of, I'm not sure if this would be considered archival, but those anecdotes from particularly people who moved to the U.S. and talked about their own experiences in the Soviet Union and how you analyze those, like through, how do I put this, that like you look for consistencies and irregularities, or maybe, maybe misperceptions on how they're explaining things to appreciated that.
It just seemed to me that it was necessary not to worry so much about the laws and decrees and statements that Stalin made. Of course, those had to be taken into consideration. But my idea was to try to build a picture from the ground up. What were people's personal experiences, and how did those fit or not fit with the orthodox or totalitarian model?
And so I think this is a problem that even just, let alone a scholar such as yourself who delves into Soviet history, but even just, I think, as if one is a socialist, they come across this a lot when even just advocating for, in the U.S., let's say, for example, advocating for, Medicare for all or universal healthcare system, somehow this will lead to the worst things that ever happened in the Soviet Union, or lead to, purge or Great Terror or gulags, etc. One gets,
and they'll take away your guns, Tony.
Exactly. All the guns we have in Canada, right?
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't realize you were there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm in Canada. Yeah. So as you mentioned, you're accused of whitewashing rather than providing nuance.
Let me mention very briefly that there still are books out there that try very hard to equate Nazism and Stalinism. There's a German, Jürgen Babarowski, who won a big prize a couple of years ago. And a number of German scholars have been involved in that effort, even to try to say that Stalin was worse than Hitler. And then we have people like Timothy Snyder in the U.S., Bloodlands, who really equates Hitler and Stalin, and I don't think that's right personally. I don't think that works well at all.
So with that said, that's a great segue to the next question. So what are some examples of these distortions, misperceptions, and even myths that are caused by the propagation of this totalitarian model or models that we've talked about? This unfortunately still has very wide popular diffusion, even if in terms of scholarship, it isn't the only perspective that dominates. So could you give us some better understandings regarding things like the gulags, the purges, and just the terror overall?
Okay, first I'll say I've come to dislike the word terror intensely, because if you start like Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, if you start that way, that to me is poisoning the well. In other words, you're saying this is terror without even exploring the dynamics of it, without exploring what happened. And so not that this is widely accepted, but I try always to talk about mass arrests, which did happen, there's no question. But why did they happen? What was going on? I think that once you start to look at who was arrested and why, and then why the terror stopped by late 1938, you begin to get a much different picture. And then there's a recent book which doesn't add a lot to what's going on, but this is a book by Lynn Viola about trials of former NKVD officers So they're put on trial in 1939, 40, and early 1941 for abusing people, beating, and even shooting them. So the police then, and this gets pretty much wide publicity across the Soviet Union. So how can we make sense of what happened? We have cases in which, for example, a 19-year-old I think she was 19-year-old ballerina in Kiev gets arrested for having a love affair with someone in the Polish consulate, and she's shot. How does that enhance Stalin's power? There was a factory making leather goods for the military not too far from Moscow. It's completely shut down. This is a critical need for the army. The factory is so devastated by arrests among the management, it shuts down. The Communist Party basically ceased to operate in the countryside in 1937-38. In what ways did that enhance Stalin's power? That's ridiculous. There really are two waves of purges within the police, within the NKVD in that period. So it's a very shaky instrument. All the Greek shoe sign boys in Odessa are rounded up and arrested. You could go on with this kind of anecdote. And I think, again, when you build a picture of the terror in that way, you come up with something quite different. Young engineers are arrested in 37-38. If there's an accident in a factory, somebody gets blamed for it. And very often the engineer in charge of that shift gets charged with sabotage and wrecking. Off he goes to the gulag or gets shot. So in what way did this enhance the economic power of the Soviet Union, Stalin's political power? None of this does work that way. And so to make the argument that this, and you can't make the argument that this was necessary for Stalin either, in my view. There's no big opposition to him. And I think if you look at the murder of his friend, I think actually Sergei Kirov in 1934, this is devastating to Stalin as a person. Stalin and Georgy Ordzhonikidze commits suicide in 1937. Stalin's almost left alone. He doesn't have friends. And of course, his wife, Nadezhda Stalina, she committed suicide in 1932. That's going to have devastating effects on anybody. A suicide of somebody close to you, that produces long-term, deep psychological effects. So I think you have to regard Stalin as a person, and something goes terribly wrong in 1937. My view of what happened is that Stalin, isolated, not really very much in touch with the country, didn't travel. He traveled down to Sochi, a resort on the Black Sea. He doesn't go outside of the Kremlin or his dacha outside of Moscow very much. And something happens, maybe it was the reports from Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the secret police, that start to frighten Stalin very badly. I think of Stalin as a very frightened man, and not sure at all of what's happening internationally, but he knows that the Germans are building their war machine. He knows that the Japanese have moved into Manchuria. What's next? They're up on the border with the Soviet Union. There was fighting in 1938-39 between Japanese forces and Soviet forces. All this, I think, caused a panic. I think you can see signs of this in Stalin's speeches, signs in the party conference in early 1938 when people start to talk very loudly and openly about excesses. The wrong people are arrested. Innocent people are arrested all over. There's even a joke about, not a joke, but it drew laughter from the Communist Party officials assembled there in Moscow. Someone reported that there was a guy arrested, I think in the Far East, and he denounced a whole lot of people as spies and saboteurs. And then that first man is exonerated and released. But the people that he denounced are still held in the gulag, and some had been shot. And everybody in attendance starts to laugh nervously. Oh, this is terrible. So there are all these signs that, and there are many more I could mention, that things get out of control. If this was a planned operation to try to eliminate enemies of the state or enemies of Stalin, it went wrong from the beginning, from the summer of 1937. And you have these utterly absurd guide numbers sent out from Moscow to provincial police authorities. You should be arresting so many former socialist revolutionaries, so many former Mensheviks, so many former criminals and so on, and people, white guards from the Civil War. The people write back in several instances from provincial police headquarters, and they say, we want to arrest many more than that. And so, okay, so they get permission from the center. They get numbers. They don't get specific people that they're supposed to target. This is madness, I think, and it can't be explained. I'm sorry, everybody wants to look for a big logical explanation. Oh, Stalin's going after a potential fifth column because he knows war is coming. Nope, sorry, the Greek shoeshine boys had nothing to do with that. The closing of a factory that makes important leather goods for the army, that's nothing to do with rooting out a fifth column. On and on, so many stories that don't fit the traditional narrative, traditional explanation, in my opinion. So that's how I tried to deal with it all.
Yeah, so I appreciate that way, maybe historiography might be the word, of, looking at this period and trying to understand it. Often the great man, theory of history, comes into play, and that person is viewed in some kind of cartoonish way where they're just for democracy, or they're just like innately evil or something like that, rather than having themselves their own complexities, let alone the whole state apparatus or their colleagues, or the different levels of society that are at play here.
Tony, let me say one thing about Stalin and the way he's treated in the mainstream press in the US, at least. And I think what has happened is that Stalin is not understandable at all as a human being. And you'll see over and over again, the New York Times has done this repeatedly. They will say, in effect, the Russian people, especially the Russian people and other Soviet peoples, they didn't understand what Stalin was doing to them. They, the Russian people, rate Stalin very highly in surveys. Peter the Great always wins in surveys as the most important, the best Russian leader of all time. Stalin comes in second. Now, you can say that that's because of the victory in World War II, but that baffles Western writers like Anne Applebaum and so on. They have never been able to come to grips with Stalin's popularity as I see it, and that can be explained in various ways. The tremendous upward social mobility, tremendous rise in literacy, even healthcare for people, as problematic as it was, resorts for workers, the massive number of people who immigrated from the countryside to cities, and if they were not able to rise, their children were. All kinds of courses for workers to learn skills, to become literate, all of that, I think. And then, of course, memories of the Russian Civil War, when the country was invaded by British, American, French, German, of course, Finnish forces. Those memories were still vivid. I think you almost have to start any discussion of 1937 by saying this was only 20 years after the Russian Revolution and only 17 or so after the end of the Russian Civil War. But we don't get that context.
No, that's definitely a great point in how these things get presented, particularly in mass media in the West. I interviewed Samantha Lom on the show. She's a Soviet historian, expert on the 1936 Soviet Constitution, and hopefully I'm kind of explaining this idea correctly that I got from her. Essentially, she puts forth the idea that particularly the countryside is so, and you kind of touched on this, is so distant from the center that they have to rely on the reports that they get from these far off places. And in terms of the mass arrest and stuff like that, they may be receiving information that either isn't true from the people who are sending it, or perhaps it's not accurate, or it's being relayed in a certain way. Can you speak to that, like dysfunction of the system leading to that, contributing, to some of the chaos that you've discussed?
Yes, I say something about that. We've had for a long time in the United States the Smolensk archives. These were records captured by the Germans when they surrounded Smolensk in 1941. They were then transferred after the war to the United States. So we've had that kind of archival material around for a long time. And it shows, and other material shows, that very often local Communist Party leaders and, let's say, collective farms tried to shape their own decisions around what they read in the newspapers rather than from any direct orders. coming to them from any central agency. So in the countryside, people are trying to figure out what do they want in the center. I mean, they want more milk, they want more steel, they want more corn, wheat, obviously. What was supposed to be done about hidden enemies of the people? Were we supposed to worry about that? Is that a big problem? Is that not a problem at all? That's something that was not well communicated from the center. And I think that's partly because the center, or let's say Stalin and a few people very close to him, Malenkov, Molotov, so on. In this sense, it was Stalin making the decisions or not making a decision where one should have been made. So there are very mixed signals sent out after Kirov's death, for example. Oh, this was done by white guards at first, counter-revolutionaries from the Russian Civil War. Or no, this was done by elements within the Communist Party who are trying to wreck it. They're capitalist agents and so on. So you get this back and forth, back and forth. Meanwhile, the courts are ruling that people arrested under the 1932 law for stealing even a bit of grain, that they're supposed to go to prison for life. The courts are rejecting that. They're not passing that kind of sentence. There's that kind of resistance. And of course, factory managers are desperately trying to maneuver between the demands of fulfilling the production plan, which is set in Moscow, and pleasing the workers enough to get them to stay on the job and produce something. So there's all these different pressures and factors going back and forth. And one of them certainly is really bad communication. They're part of the Smolensk archives, and I've seen this in other places too. The local party officials or local police officials are making notes in the margins of newspapers about what to do. They don't even have their own paper. Most of the provincial, even party organizations, did not have telephones in the 1930s. They relied on telegraph for many communications. And in many cases, I can't give you this off the top of my head, the center in 1936, the Central Party authorities don't know who local Communist Party leaders are, let alone who the members, ordinary rank and file members of the party are. They don't know where people live. Take the city of Magnitogorsk. There aren't street signs. There aren't addresses. To try to find somebody in the midst of all this, a specific person, is really, really difficult. So in that sense, communications and relaying of orders and so on, that's a terrible mess.
I think it was what you've just described, that dysfunction, is one of the things that made me lose faith, I guess, in the concept of the totalitarian model, which is just kind of, that I'd received through school. And it's like, oh, how's that possible? They're so dysfunctional. Even as a socialist, it's like, the Soviet Union is an example to learn from, of course, but that's one thing that should be learned from.
That's something that's bothered me for a long time. I spent a summer in Poland long ago, and every Pole that many Poles that I met had some kind of side hustle. Uncle Zbigniew raises pigs, and he brings pork to the cities and sells it illegally or on the side. And that's the way so much. And then I spent 2 years in the Soviet Union, 2 different years. And everybody had a way of getting toilet paper, for example, dish detergent outside. It's called nalievo, on the left, outside of the regular organizations and so on. So what was total in the Soviet Union? I've never been able to figure out anything that was total. And if nothing is total, how can you have totalitarianism? I mean, it's either total or not. It's like unique. It's unique or it's not unique. Come on. So that's why I believe in the term lived socialism. I don't know if you know Mary Fulbrook's work on East Germany. Very interesting stuff about how people actually lived in East Germany. And it runs counter to the myth of totalitarianism there. Very interesting stuff.
I'll definitely check that out. Thank you for those excellent points. So moving on to our next question, you mentioned in your work that it was actually, rather than the average Soviet citizen, it was elites who were the target of these mass arrests, often in the executions. Why is that?
My idea was that the higher the responsibility a person had, the more likely it was that something would go wrong. And in the manic phase, the terribly chaotic, uncontrolled phase of the terror, which I would say was not that long. It's long enough to kill a whole lot of people. Summer of 1937 on into 1938. At that time, anybody with a position of responsibility could be targeted if anything went wrong, or if that person had, let's say, a relative in Poland and had been corresponding with that relative for 15 years. All of a sudden, that's a crime. All of a sudden, that's somehow terribly threatening to Stalin. Oh, if you believe the reasons for why they were arrested. An engineer, I've mentioned this, an engineer in a factory would be responsible for a shift. If a worker was injured during that shift, or if production stopped because a machine broke or something like that, in the height of this hysteria, I think, that's a terrible word in a way because it goes back to women, but anyway, panic, there you go. In the midst of that, somebody had to be blamed for what had happened. Now, workers could be and were arrested. It's not that didn't happen, but I found cases of people quitting jobs as engineers to become truck drivers or elevator operators, something like that, because they understood, I have this position and there's responsibility, and with that responsibility goes risk. If something goes wrong, I may be arrested. That was already the target. That sequence was the target of criticism from within the party by early 1938. But yet it went on. 1938 is really a curious year because you have mass arrests, but fewer than in 1937. And again, in 1937, the arrests were really concentrated in the second or even less than that of the year. The July or August 1937 to the end of the year is the worst. 1938, arrests go up and down, and there's a lot of criticism, and people wrote thousands and thousands of letters to Stalin and to Kalinin, president, not solely ceremonial, of the USSR, the head of the Supreme Soviet, and they protested the arrest of relatives on a huge scale, and sometimes that worked. So the people are not cowed completely by terror. I think I'm getting away from your original question, though.
No, you were answering that. So kind of like to kind of conclude that point. So if the elites or the people who had responsibilities were targeted, then how did just the average person who, most people weren't in positions of authority or responsibility in that sense? You were saying that they weren't, cowed or demoralized? What I kind of missed.
No, I don't think so. I just don't see the evidence for that. And as you know from my book, workers took advantage of the panic again to denounce bosses, to denounce administrators who had not tried hard enough in the workers' eyes to improve conditions for them. And there was a lot of that on the collective farms as well. A lot of collective farm chairmen were, and I don't know how many women there ever were, but that would have been a really slim minority among chair people of collective farms. Anyway, chairmen of collective farms were often accused of being drunkards, of rapes, of stealing. So this was in some ways an opportunity for ordinary workers and peasants to strike back at bosses who had been unfair, overbearing, or who had simply not really exerted themselves to improve conditions for workers. That was a dangerous thing for the government. It had to walk a delicate line there between allowing workers some ability to express grievances. It's still called the workers' state. So there had to be some credibility for that side of things, but it couldn't get out of hand, or too many factory administrators would be sent off to the gulag. And who was going to replace these people, by the way? I mean, if you removed an engineer from production, especially a young one who had been trained and in whom the Soviet state had invested a lot of time and resources, who was going to replace that person? There was not an unlimited supply of young Soviet engineers, by the way. There were some hard practical facts that Stalin eventually had to deal with. and finally did, I think, by late 1939, 38, late 38.
This is a question that I really wanted to ask you. And I've looked and I haven't seen you kind of address this, at least in writing before online that I could find. One of your greatest, and you can correct this this presentation if you wish, one of your greatest academic rivals was Soviet historian Robert Conquest. So for our listeners who aren't aware, Robert Conquest was a Soviet historian, and he was a big, or potentially the biggest proponent during this period of the totalitarian model. And I think it wasn't until the 1990s when a journalist kind of uncovered this, that Robert Conquest had worked in the 1940s and the 1950s for British intelligence at what was called the IRD, or the Information Research Department, which was a propaganda outfit meant to manipulate public opinion in a way that was negative towards the Soviet Union. And then even after that, in the 1960s onward, even though he wasn't directly employed by this IRD organization, he used information still provided by them in popular publications through companies that, for example, printed CIA-influenced materials about the Soviet Union. And they did all of this, again, without informing the public that they were tied to intelligence, or they're backed by intelligence services. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on Conquest's work and Western intelligence-backed Western Sovietology.
I think that Conquest survived those revelations quite handily. And in 2015, he was awarded it couldn't have been that late. It was George W. Bush who awarded Conquest the American Medal of Freedom. And there's a fabulous scene there. Conquest was waiting to receive the medal with Muhammad Ali and Aretha Franklin. It's just hideously funny in a grotesque way. And so Conquest, he remained absolutely in favor. His big book, The Great Terror, was redone. It came out on a second edition in the midst of all this in the 90s. And Conquest remained a kind of the lion of the Orthodox school. Terrific womanizer, and never mind that. But anyway, he was never really damaged in the public's mind. In academic circles, his work became terribly controversial. And I don't know where Conquest got all the sources that he used for the book, The Great Terror. And then he kept writing Harvest of Sorrow and other things. Whether he was funded by the CIA or the British at that point, I really don't know. But he had a very comfortable position at the Hoover Institution, which is on the campus of Stanford University, but everybody says it's an independent organization. Well, that thing has been dedicated to anti-communism since its inception in the 1920s. And one other thing about Conquest, I met him several times, and he at one point came down to the rotunda of the Hoover Institution to meet me. That was the first time I met him. And he had an office on, let's say, the 5th floor. He never, as far as I could ever figure or understand from anybody, he never went down from the 5th floor of the Hoover Institution to the basement to look at its archives on material from the 1930s. He wasn't interested in that. His book edition is basically a catalog of who was arrested, but not much analysis of why. It's just, Stalin's power, Stalin's vanity, and no real understanding of the dynamics of it. So, by the way, I tried to get my students to read portions of that book, and they almost staged a revolution on the spot. They said, this is horrible stuff. We don't know how to pronounce these names at all. And they go on and on and on and on. So I only tried that one time. Anyway, Conquest was accounted a charming man, I guess, in the sense of a good old British boy, if we're allowed to say that, but from the upper crust. He went to Oxford and so on, and was in that sort of literary circle. You can think of examples, Tony Larkin and that sort of person. Anyway, so he lived the best of all possible Western worlds. He lived in London for a while, and then he was able to move, as every Brit wants to California and enjoy the sunshine and so on out there. And he was set up very nicely at the Hoover Institution. He had no responsibilities for teaching. I don't know if he ever went to a committee meeting. Why would he? He was just able to sit there and then travel out and give lectures. So I don't have any idea if he believed what he was writing in a big way, but I think I've never been asked by any government official to comment on Soviet affairs or on the war in Ukraine or anything. But I have the distinct feeling that once people get sucked into thinking that they might have some influence on government, that they really like that. And it's prestige, and they get flown around, and they get to go to dinner with the secretary of blah, blah, and all that. Whether that happened to Conquest or not, I don't know. He, like others, started as a communist, supposedly, at university, and then, of course, abandoned that quite quickly. That was Arthur Kessler, Richard Crossman, other people went through that same kind of process. And I think once you lose a sense of romance about Stalin and Soviet communism in the 30s, Soviet socialism, then the tendency was to really veer in the other direction and become an outspoken critic of it all.
Yeah, I can only imagine that it must have been maybe annoying is not a good enough word, but the fact that you were attacked or smeared as being some pro-Stalinist or pro crimes that happened in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, there's someone who actually worked for MI5 and with the assistance of the CIA, and actually those organizations actually created massive havoc throughout the world. He's collaborating with them essentially in his research. Yeah, it's wild. I feel like that's, again, I think this is another thing that made me lose this kind of faith or that I'd received in just general education about this totalitarian model, understanding the influence of intelligence agencies in the production or manufacturing, I guess, of history.
That certainly happened an awful lot. It even extended in the United States into sponsoring George Balanchine, the choreographer, and sponsoring ex-Soviet dancers and emigres performing ballets. And this was supposed to be real Russian culture, and what the Soviets had was supposed to be fake or crummy socialist culture. And they did produce a lot of very bad paintings and so on. But nonetheless, there was a serious amount of attention to good writing and, of course, good ballet, classical, and a very serious effort to get ordinary people involved in reading the Russian classics, the pre-revolutionary stuff. It's interesting to me, by the way, just as another little side note here, that in all the words that Stalin said to the public and the things that he printed in the 20s and 30s, you can find all of that. He cited Russian authors over and over again. All of the ones that he cited were pre-revolutionary authors. Chekhov, Tolstoy, for example. He stayed away from Dostoevsky, too psychological, but he never cited a single Soviet writer, no Gorky, for example.
So I think in that kind of distinction that's made of, pre-communism cultures being the authentic or real culture is promoted in a sense by the Falun Gong, which is this religion, some might call it a cult, that has Chinese in origin, that's very anti-communist in nature. They do this play called Shenyun, which is,
I've seen it.
Yes. Yeah, so everyone's either heard of it, seen it, they've seen a poster somewhere, for sure. Yeah. And it says, I think, China before communism, and that's kind of the whole point, is that things were so great before. In your work, and you already kind of touched on this briefly, you discuss what some would call a workplace democracy or workers' participation in this Soviet system, noting that the workers have the ability to openly critique their bosses and fight for, labor rights in ways that were, if we compared it to the US or maybe Canada at the time, was more advanced. Could you give some examples and provide some context on this emergent, facet of what they at least called as a workers' state?
There were all kinds of institutions that workers could turn to in the factories if they were unhappy about conditions. They could turn to the labor unions, and most writers think that the labor unions were completely eviscerated in the early 30s. No, I don't think so. because we have lots of records, or I found lots of records of trade unions responding to workers' complaints positively. There were commissions within the factories on which workers sat, and they had the ability to criticize and demand redress of grievances. And there are any number of cases in which that happened. So, and you can think of the Communist Party itself as in one way as a giant complaint bureau across the country. And so workers learned very quickly, it wasn't hard to learn the right kind of language to use. They would say, you are not defending the working class. You talk about all these benefits and wonderful things for the working class, and look at the conditions in the cafeteria. They're filthy and so on. Now, nobody could say Stalin is a jerk, socialism sucks, that type of thing. You couldn't say that. But as far as criticizing local conditions, and even up to the level of the factory director and not the top party boss in the region, but maybe the second level, there are many, many cases of that. So I think this is and workers participated in these commissions and in the trade unions and so on. And so I see all of that as part of the state apparatus and as the intersection of state and society. You can't separate state from society because there were so many, many ways in which people participated in state organizations that had some power to get things changed.
And in your work, you pull some of these anecdotes from the archival research, as you mentioned, but also from the testimonies of people who had defected at some point to the U.S. And I found them so interesting because I think it was like for some of them, essentially, while maybe trying to push forth the idea that the Soviet Union was totalitarian and that it is a very grim place, they would have these anecdotes of things that wouldn't even have been possible in the U.S. at the time.
But by the way, most of these were not defectors, but rather people who had often been captured by the Germans or removed by the Germans, the so-called Ostarbeiter, the Eastern workers made to work in German factories. So they often, or some of them at least, had experience in three types of factories: Soviet factory, German factories, in which they were totally expendable, and they could be killed with no remorse or worked to death and so on. And also experience in American factories. There aren't too many people like that, but there were definitely some. And you're right. Several of them talked about how it was possible to go to speak to the director of the factory in the Soviet Union. It was possible to talk to the trade union boss or the party representative in the factory. In the U.S., very, very few workers were unionized, very few. And so there just weren't those kinds of opportunities. If a worker and if a worker had gone in 1937 to complain to the boss, unless that had been a really skilled, valuable worker, the boss might have said, "No, screw you. Take a hike. There are 5,000 people ready to apply for your job." In the Soviet Union, skilled workers and ones who remained sober, which was a big problem, they were highly valued. The bosses had to meet the production plan. If they didn't meet their production plan, the bosses, the factory directors, would get in big trouble. So they had to placate or work with the workers, do something for them to get them to stay on the job in the midst of the fabulous labor turnover that I describe in the book. So on a strictly practical basis, or on the basis of, I don't want to be arrested, I'm a factory director, you had to listen to the workers and do something for their benefit, or they would move on, even after the so-called draconian labor laws of 1938-39. It was just a question of survival for many people.
So with all this in mind, we've just covered the mass arrests, what some people refer to still as the Great Terror. Given what we've just discussed, what does the Soviet citizen response to the Nazi invasion in 1941 tell us about the support for the average citizen towards the Soviet system?
First of all, workers seem to have responded a lot more enthusiastically than other groups in society. Workers and a good part of the intelligentsia responded very positively right away. And there's so many stories of workers volunteering to go to the front, signing up right away. Then when you get to the peasants, it's such a broad, vast story, and I don't think it's been investigated seriously enough. I think the response was, yes, we need to fight for the motherland. We need to fight these invaders. And then there's something that to me was really interesting. When the Germans crossed a new border, the 1939 border, that was the area that the Soviet Union had taken from Poland in 1939. It was populated mostly by Ukrainians. And that had been a real hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism against the Polish government. So the Germans reported that that's where the welcome was warmest for them. And Hitler, there's a group that came out to greet Hitler during the Anschluss with Austria in 1938. And these Ukrainians brought him a wreath that said, "To the liberator of small peoples." So, and those people were from Western Ukraine, Lviv, and so on. So the Germans reported that when they crossed the old border into the old Soviet Union, the response was much colder. And so that's got to raise the question of why was the response colder in the area where the repression was supposedly the worst? And I think, and a lot of people have not understood that or not even noted that, but others have. And so I think peasant response depended on a whole host of factors. Did the peasants get tractors? Did the tractors work? Were the peasants able to go and sell produce from their own private markets, which were never eliminated? Could they sell produce, meat, etc., to markets in the cities? Could they make money that way? Were they getting remittances from men who had gone to work in the factories? The conditions in Soviet collective farms varied tremendously, and we don't have that much information. It's not right to say that the Soviet army did not fight well until the stories of German atrocity reached deep into the Soviet Union. The Red Army fought hard right from the start, but was encircled in many, many cases. The Germans had complete control of the air. I mean, total control of the air into well into 1942. Soviet units were surrounded and often surrendered because their officers were dead, they ran out of fuel, they ran out of ammunition, food, they even ran out of water. What would you have done? What would I have done in that situation? I think I would have surrendered in the hope that I would live. So that's a very complicated story, the response. Let's say it varied tremendously, but I think there was a lot of solid support for Stalin and for socialism in some sense at that time.
Okay, so with that said, Robert, thank you again for joining me today. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about a topic that they probably briefly learned about in school at some point, the Soviet Union, the so-called Great Terror, but you provided a lot of insight based on archival research, extensive archival research that you've done. And so I just want to say thank you so much again for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Tony. I appreciated your questions and the knowledge that you bring to this topic.